So without further ado, Karen.
Thank you, Bill. So can everybody see the screen? Is it showing up all right?
Yep, it looks good.
We don't have black boxes over things, hopefully. And you can hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So, as Alaskans, we are all well aware that climate change is happening faster in the high latitudes of the Arctic than anywhere else on the planet. But what changes do regular Alaskans see every day in their local environment? And how do these changes affect their lifestyles? As Jacob Martin of Nome notes, it's not always the big changes like melting sea ice that we all hear about, but sometimes it's the small things that outsiders may not even be aware of. And he says, quote, "It's one thing to say, yeah, we can head out a week earlier next year hunting, but sometimes you're not always thinking of that. You're thinking, I have a giant puddle under my house and my house might get swallowed by a sinkhole, which is very real here in Nome. There are houses that need fill year after year, so it's very real because sooner or later things are going to change, and they're going to change so fast people can't adapt." Why is this not? There, okay. People who have deep connections to the land and sea around them are key witnesses to environmental change. Their observations are essential for building a broader understanding of the past, of how things are changing, of the effects this change is having on people, and for planning for future adaptation. Documenting traditional local knowledge is also critical to interpreting previously collected scientific data. Many signs of climate change can be seen in Alaska's national parks and nearby communities. In 2018 and 2019, the National Park Service teamed up with us at UAF's Oral History Program to record conversations with long-term residents and Park Service employees in Skagway and Nome, and to have them talk about their observations of change and the effects on people in these two distinct coastal regions of Alaska. This presentation will highlight some of the similarities and differences between how these two far-flung locations in Alaska experience elements of climate change. Melting glaciers and loss of sea ice are two of the most well-known impacts of climate change in the north. And in Skagway, ice appears as high mountain glaciers and frozen lakes and rivers. In Nome, of course, sea ice is critical to continuing traditions of harvesting subsistence foods. As the ice changes, so do people's lifestyles and ways of thinking about the places they live. When you ask about changing ice conditions in Skagway, talk immediately turns to glaciers and the effects warming temperatures are having on them. And as we all know, glaciers are melting and receding. And Joanne Byerly of Skagway, she noted, quote, "We're just in tears some days when we see big chunks of ice falling off our glacier on Harding Mountain. It's amazing how fast the glacier is receding." In comparison, John McDermott mentions increased flooding as something related to melting glaciers. And he said, quote, "The floods are a little more frequent because there's more glacial melting that's contributing to the river levels. These higher river levels also can contribute to bank erosion and sea level rise and more cold water and sediment in the river that negatively affects fragile riverine ecosystems. And these details may not be something that most people think about when they're thinking about increased glacial melting. In Nome, change to sea ice is, of course, one of the top climate change issues. Roy Ashenfelter states what many of us have been hearing for a long time, quote, "There's less sea ice, it goes out earlier, and freeze up is a lot later. The winter season is shorter and is taking longer to occur." Access to stable, solid, and safe sea ice is essential for subsistence, such as seal and walrus hunting, crabbing and fishing under the ice. But there are other changes happening to the Bering Sea ice that are less well known. For example, Charlie Lean observes, quote, huge pressure ridges formed east-west when I was young. I remember monster icebergs as big as a house in Norton Sound and multi-year icebergs stranded on the beach in Nome. The last time I saw one was in the early 1960s. Or as Gay Sheffield says, quote, there's a domino effect related to the loss of sea ice. The ocean temperatures are now very, very warm, and animals from the southern Bering Sea are moving north and surviving, where in the past they didn't do well in the cold water. Changing ice conditions in the Bering Sea has broader impacts on communities in coastal ecosystems beyond just the loss of sea ice for subsistence. Of greatest concern is coastal erosion and the protection the sea ice provides to community infrastructure. And Jeanette Colch explains this when she says, quote, the loss of sea ice causes more erosion and damage to the coast. As we get storm surges, the ice acts as a protecting barrier to the coast. And when it doesn't exist, it really increases erosion. And it really makes communities worry because protections that they used to have from the ice aren't there. Melting permafrost is, of course, another top issue that many people associate with climate change in Alaska. With the rising temperatures, it's melting the frozen ground and it's forever altering the landscape. Because it's so far south, Skagway doesn't have much permafrost, so people there didn't really talk about that melting permafrost. In contrast, in Nome, people were very concerned about the ground thawing around them. Charlie Lean explains the impacts of melting permafrost on infrastructure when he says, quote, things have reached a tipping point, with the average temperature being above freezing, so the ground is thawing. Houses are suffering. They are shifting, which leads to sheetrock cracking, breaks in sewer lines and water pipes, and a big mess. And Roy Ashenfelter mentions the critical cultural impacts of melting permafrost that outsiders may not be aware of when he says, quote, our ice cellars built into the permafrost are melting. We can't keep our traditional foods preserved in them anymore. We have to use freezers. Oops. Okay. Many lakes in Northwest Alaska have drained due to melting permafrost. As David Swanson explains, quote, lakes are suddenly draining due to thawing permafrost. The water is held in because the ground around it is frozen and creates a barrier. But as permafrost thaws, it creates a passage through which the water can escape, and so the lakes drain. Flowing water then enhances thaw of permafrost. This happens naturally, but is now occurring at an unprecedented rate. Without these lakes and water, the surrounding tundra becomes drier and new vegetation grows in the former lake beds. This changes the appearance of the landscape, what plants and animals can survive, and in some places increases the risk of wildfires. But for Tazzy Jones, whether this is a good or bad change depends upon your perspective. And he says, quote, lakes suddenly just drain and create no water habitat. It now becomes filled with vegetation. Fish might be losers, but maybe some birds are winners. You kind of have to look at it as just a change in habitat type. People in Skagway and Nome mentioned other environmental changes besides the ones I've mentioned. They often discuss the same things, such as weather changes and things, but their own particular local perspective affected how they talked about these things. So they said the changing weather is a common theme. And in both Skagway and Nome, everyone agreed that the winters are getting warmer. For example, John McDermott of Skagway says, quote, it's warmer and it's wetter. When we were first out in Dyea, which is just right by Skagway, I'd see it 20, 22 below, something like that, and howling winds. And that would last for a stretch of time. Now it might get to 4 below instead. We still have the strong winds, but we don't have the amount of snowfall that we did before. We have more rain. Warmer winters with more rain and less snow in Skagway has led to recurring freeze-thaw cycle that creates more icing conditions than in the past when it got cold and stayed cold all winter. But Ken Atkinson of Known explains the effect that he's seen of changing weather patterns there. Quote, "The weather pattern is different now. Storms used to come from the north, bringing bad blizzards where you'd get big drifts surrounded by bare ground. Today, more storms are coming from the south that are wetter with more moisture. So that means more heavy snowfall and even rain, and the snowdrift pattern is different." These unpredictable weather patterns make it harder to plan travel, recreation, and subsistence activities. People in Skagway talk about how there's more rain in the past, and this has led to increased coastal and river erosion. For example, the Taya River that flows 17 miles from Chilkoot Pass at the US-Canada border into Upper Lynn Canal has flooded more times in recent years than throughout its recorded history. The river's heavy flow is eating away the riverbank along the Chilkoot Trail and at the old Dyea town site, taking pieces of history along with it. In fact, in 2022, as this picture shows, the flood took out bridges and so badly damaged parts of the trail that it has been closed to hikers. Now, in Nome, residents also observed warmer and shorter winters with less snow and more rain. And there, winter has traditionally been the prime travel season. Frozen rivers, lakes, and sea ice offer a smooth and fast traveling surface. These travel corridors are vital for rural communities like Nome, where residents have been sustained by hunting, fishing, and trapping for generations. Not being able to access subsistence foods at the right season can have severe personal and cultural impacts. Okay, sorry, I lost my place. The consequences of more winter rain on animals and scientific research are less obvious to those who do not live and work in the region. For example, Jacob Martin says, quote, "There's more freezing rain than in the past, and it coats everything. And then it turns into a layer of ice. That freezing rain makes it harder for everything that is using the lichen that is now covered with ice. Caribou have to dig for lichen to survive, or even animals like lemmings that live on the tundra on that top surface and hibernate underground or under the snow layer. This ice layer causes issues for them for getting food and into their tunnels and burrows." Or Letty Hughes, who's a biologist with Bering Land Bridge National Preserve, explains how this change in the winter patterns affects their research when she says, quote, "When there's not enough snow, it's hard to do a good aerial survey. You're literally trying to find brown muskox or a brown moose on brown vegetation. It's so much easier to see the dark animals against the white snow. And so you can be more comfortable with your results. If there's just not enough snow to do this type of method now, what do we do?" It's something that I think a lot of people don't think about, the effects on research. Now, changes in the timing of the seasons was another common theme mentioned in both Skagway and Nome. And in both places, everyone agreed spring is arriving earlier and fall is starting later. This not only makes for a longer growing season, but it affects the arrival and departure of migratory animals that people hunt and may shift the location of where the animals are found. Devoted gardeners are keen observers of conditions that may impact their productivity. And gardening is a big activity in Skagway. So our gardeners there had things to say. As Elaine Furbish says, quote, "The timing between the last freeze and the first freeze makes a big difference for the planting season. So with the growing season getting longer, we get better harvests." Or Lynn Cameron explains how warming temperatures have actually changed her gardening practices. Quote, "Over the period from 1987 to 2017, we have definitely seen a trend to it being warmer and drier, and it has changed the way we garden. Those plants that we depended on doing well in a maritime climate and for moist weather did not do well this year because it was too hot and dry, and we had to water. I'm not used to having to water so much. Now, in Skagway, winter arriving later and spring coming earlier has been good for gardeners, but a similar seasonal shift in Nome is having negative effects. The shorter winters mean shorter ice season, and this has the ripple effect, as I've said, of limiting snow machine travel and reducing access for subsistence activities. And Jeanette Colt says, quote, "It doesn't freeze up as early as it used to, so the subsistence window on the ice is shortened. Rivers and lakes that are used to use aren't freezing as solid, So a river or lake that they used to go ice fishing on at a certain time of year is no longer accessible." And you know, as we know, a shorter subsistence season can mean an empty freezer for families who depend upon seasonally specific traditional foods. And Roy Ashenfelter explains the impact of animals no longer being accessible at the right time of year, that people are used to hunting them or by the same means of access. And he says, quote, "Less sea ice means fewer hauling out areas for seals, which makes seal hunting harder. It's safer to hunt when there are pans of ice around instead of having to travel a long distance in open water to reach seals on the ice or having to hunt them in the water." Changes in vegetation were also observed in both communities, albeit in different ways. As environmental conditions change in a particular place, plants will either adapt or die. Flowering plants may bloom earlier or later. Tree species may start to appear in new places outside their normal range, or new types of flowers or vegetables may be able to survive in a home garden as the growing season, amount of rain, and soil conditions change. One thing related to vegetation that was only mentioned in Skagway was plant diseases. Again, this was from our gardeners who observed new diseases that they attributed to climate change. As Emily Willis, quote, says, "The rose hips are turning black. The flower will be great and beautiful and the bush is healthy and normal looking. And then as the rose hip starts to form, it either doesn't grow or turns yellow or black. And it might actually get reddish and then it will turn black." Sorry, we had a cat catastrophe. It might actually kind of reddish and then it will turn black. Or there's more spots. They don't ripen in time. And then they just turn black. Or Lynn Cameron said, "There's a rust color fungus on the raspberries that came in about 2 years ago that causes a darkening of the leaf and destroys their ability to bear fruit. It's devastating to the raspberry bush." In Nome, people mention the increase in willows when they're growing on the tundra, when they're talking about changes in vegetation, and it's what they call shrubification. And this has altered the landscape and the species that thrive there. And Roy Ashenfelter says, quote, "The biggest change is the growth of willows. Because of warmer temperatures, they grow faster, longer, and maintain their growth. So they are expanding out into more areas and growing taller. Willows provide food for moose, so more willows means more moose." Impacts to wildlife from climate change were also a key topic in the interviews. It not only means fewer game animals that humans depend on for food, like moose or caribou, but it affects the entire interconnected ecosystem. The loss of one species means the possible loss of another species that relies on it. The loss of wildlife from possible climate change hit close to home in Skagway in 2016, when a large number of dead birds washed ashore on the beach, and it's created a deep concern in the community. Joanne Byerly explains what happened. She says, quote, "There was that one year in January where I collected 40 dead common murres from the beach, and those are just the birds that came ashore. So there may have been thousands and thousands of them. It turned out they were starving to death. The little fish the murres eat were not providing enough fat to support the bird. I think this is probably related to warmer water from climate change, that affected the fish's food source. And changing weather patterns also can bring new species of animals to the area where they previously wouldn't have been able to survive, such as was just mentioned about the moose moving in with the willows. Some people consider these invasive species, and they can often keep spreading as they outcompete native species. New species mentioned in the interviews in Nome include beavers. Charlie Lean said, beavers are creating major changes on the landscape by creating new ponds and watercourses, but their dams are also creating wintering ponds for coho salmon and preventing other fish from moving upstream to spawn, which means a decrease in those species. And as said before about moose in the Nome area, shrubs are moving north, so are the moose. In Skagway, the arrival of ringneck doves is a new bird species. And Lynn Cameron also talked about that, quote, we see a lot more crows, less warblers, and we've had rusty blackbirds and red-winged blackbirds start coming through, which were not as common in the past. And then Emily Willis talks about a change in the insect population. She said, quote, I've noticed a lot more woolly bear caterpillars. Never saw woolly bears 10 years ago. At first it was, oh, wow, you're cute. This year it's, oh my God, you're all over my willow. You're on my raspberries. Yeah, so they've really increased here. Over a number of years, people in Nome have noticed changes in the timing of the caribou migration. As Charlie Lean said, quote, the change in timing of the seasons is affecting the caribou migration. Winter weather used to chase them south, but now it's not getting as cold and stormy, so caribou stay in the north longer and do not migrate until later. And more moose moving into the region we've already talked about. And this can mean a change to subsistence hunting practices and wild foods harvested. And then also you may have heard recently in the news about how there's more muskox are being seen closer to town in Nome. While both Skagway and Nome are coastal communities that rely upon marine resources, changes to marine life were only discussed in Nome. The main changes noted by Nome residents were the presence of new species, the earlier arrival of fish, collapse of the king crab fishery, all which due to changes in ocean temperature and salinity. The countless ways climate change affects our lives, environment, resources, and the places we care about are not yet completely understood. But it is clear that as humans, we will need to change our behaviors in order to continue to live where we do. Observations from people living in and near Alaska's national park lands on the front lines of climate change demonstrate how deep the impacts can be. It's not just about whether there are more or less bears in a park or that a recreational hiking trail is not accessible. Seasonal changes, unreliable ice conditions, thawing permafrost, and differences in animals and habitat all affect human activities and use of resources. This provides new insights into what climate change means for Alaska's national parks and how the National Park Service might respond to these changes. This project's goals were to show that climate change isn't just an academic issue for scientists and resource managers, but that firsthand experiences with climate change can be dramatic, life-changing, and sometimes life-threatening for people who work, live, and travel amid such changes. And I encourage you to go to conversations about change and the Observing Change in Alaska's National Parks Project Jukebox websites to explore more about what Alaskans have said about environmental change in these two communities of Nome and Skagway. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. Or if we're doing questions at the end, I don't know.
Thank you, KB. Let's do have 2 or 3 questions. We've got time. We're doing well. Do we have questions for Karen? Way in the back, yes.
Yeah. When we had our conference and now I remember talking to people and being struck by how change seemed to be more people seem to be more accustomed to everything changing. And I wonder if you found any of that, you know, like people in Skagway not being so accustomed to things changing, and maybe people in Nome being a little more like things change.
I haven't thought about it that way. That's a good observation. It may be that, you know, people who are so reliant on the land and the sea, you know, people who are heavy subsistence users, that they are more used to having to adapt and change, and you know, native culture has gone through a lot of adaptations and change through time, and they're maybe more used to it than people in Skagway. They're not as connected to the land in the same way. It's an interesting thought. I haven't thought about it.
Other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Karen. That was good. Don't go away, Katie.
This isn't really a question, but I just wanted to mention, and maybe somebody knows more about this than me, but I noticed one of the main informants was Charlie Lean. Yeah. And my understanding is that he's the grandson of the Lean who's stored in Cooper Landing. We saw at a presentation yesterday.
Really? I know they have property in Cooper. They're there now. Right?
Their family's founders of Cooper's Landing.
Yeah, yeah. I think I interviewed his father years ago.
You know, just make one more comment too. I would argue that
this is Carol Gales.
Oh yeah, just that the rain and icy bit contributed to the incident of the muskox killing that guy last December, because the muskox usually stay up on the ridge tops in the winter, but it was all frozen, they couldn't get through. So you could see they were like coming down where people are and where that dog team was, and that so you had food stressed animals and a guy trying to protect his dog team, and I would say it was a direct contributor to that situation.
Yeah, and there's also the introduction of the wood bison in the Innoko River area, that they had a huge loss in that population because of this last winter's icing conditions and heavy snow. So it clearly affects the animals everywhere.
Okay, we're going to move on to presentation on Morningside, and it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Ganley to talk about
that. Well, hello again. The conference, which was held in Fairfield. The Morningside project grew organically during the first years. It was just Karen Perdue and I at the beginning thinking it was a great idea. And we weren't affiliated with any of the usual homes of historical research, like universities or foundations or nonprofits. We were totally built on the enthusiasm of our researchers, and we were all hooked on the story. That's how we got together. Scherbach, the next presenter, was an undergrad in Portland who contacted us when he was doing his final paper for college in Portland. He wanted to do it on Morningside. A year later, he contacted us again to see if we would assist with his final project, but this time it was his master's degree from the UNC School of Information and Library Science. And the work he did a lot of interviews with all of us involved. It really crystallizes our current conundrum. I'll provide an overview of the history of our efforts, and Sheer will discuss community archives and the challenges to the future of our project. And then I hope for you all to work to give us some ideas. We're really very much looking for the next step for the project. Most of us are aging out is what's happening. So let's see. Okay, got it. Okay. Second slide. Okay, from the very beginning, we agreed that the goals of our work were going to focus on families and to assist them in finding their lost Alaskans. We knew that people still didn't know where some people went, and that actually included Karen. Morningside Hospital, we'd like to have it recognized as a more important part of Alaskan history. I think there's the one history book I've seen in this curriculum is it's about 2 sentences, and we believe it's a much bigger historical fact. And the other thing we've always wanted to do, never gotten much traction on, is monuments in Alaska and or Portland. Next. The project began with a conversation between Karen and I and hallway outside of my office at Information Insights. We very much decided to focus on patients with our research rather than spending time also looking at policy administration, investigations, other things like that. We did a lot of work in those areas anyway, but the priority was always patients. We secured funding to go to Portland, and our first visit was the Oregon Historical Society. They had very little patient information, but it was clear from the records that they had a long history in Portland and were involved in the Portland community. From there, we went to Greenwood Hills Cemetery, where we heard that there were Morningside graves, patient graves. And we found a few graves, but most were overgrown. And the cemetery caretaker told us that someone from Alaska had stopped by and was looking for a relative. As it turned out, it was another Fairbanks and Robin Renfro, who we both knew. And she was at the time working for Doyon, and she's a genealogist. She also had a relative in Morningside. So 2009 rolls around, and we're still in the search for patient names. At this point, the only names we had, the number of names we had, were 300 names that were in a letter written by Judge Wickersham in 1910. Since we had so little patient information, we decided to ask the public for information. Pictures and family memories. We used a lot of social media for this. The Morningside website and blog went online, and we gained viewers and interest quickly. We got many requests for information from family members asking if their relative was sent there and what happened to them. At this point, we couldn't answer many questions. Then we went to the National Archives too in College Park, Maryland. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's a really wondrous place. On the first day we were there, we found quarterly invoices that Morningside sent to the Department of Interior. The invoices included names of patients, deaths, diagnoses, their home community, and admit dates. We scanned for 3 days and came home with the basis for our eventual database. On the very last day, close to the last hour we were there, Karen found her uncle's name in one of the records. Next one. There we go. That's the National Archives too in Maryland. It's the Archives for Administrative Records of the U.S. government. In 2010 was a big year. We got a $60,000 grant from the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. And it was given to us to develop the patient database and to support research travel. The Lost Alaskans Facebook page and went up, and the virtual cemetery went online. The new territorial court records were located that year. Nisha Steinkruger and Meg Green, both of whom were Superior Court judges at the time, joined the group and have concentrated on that research. The following fall, we did a presentation at AFN Elders and Youth and the Alaska Historical Society. We recruited additional members, and by the end of the year, the project team was complete. 2011 started off with a bang. We were notified that the Morningside Hospital History Project had received the Pathfinder Award from the Alaska Historical Society. We were very surprised and very, very happy about it. Okay, this is a team that we ended up with by 2011. And we've had a couple of our members have are now deceased. Everybody's retired pretty much, which brings us to why I'm making this presentation. Next. Now that we had a full team, we had our first face-to-face meeting. We had researchers there from Fairbanks, Anchorage, Juneau, and Portland. This is almost everybody except the two guys that did the cemetery research in Portland. On January 1st, 2013, the Morningside Hospital patient database went online. It was housed at the Alaska Mental Health by the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority, and their website provided some Morningside history and a link to the database. Links were also added to the website blog and the Facebook pages, and we began to hear from families immediately. There were, at that point, we had also had 500 death certificates available on the Morningside Hospital research website. Next slide. During 1915, the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority ended in 2014. And since then, we've been essentially unfunded. We worked with the Ancestry.com and provided them with a patient database. They said it was up, but I was never actually able to get it to work. So, the last article at that time was posted on the website blog, and at that point we had 300 followers on the Facebook page. In 2020, slide. 2020 will be remembered as the year the patient database went down. After 7 years, we're still not quite sure what happened, but it was no longer working and still isn't functioning. Okay, so that brings us up to today. The Facebook page, we have 500 followers at this point. It's still growing. I got somebody new yesterday. The website blog needs updating. You can still read articles on it, but the links don't work. There are links to documents. There's also links to the patient database. Our research on the court records has continued. I think Nisha's been to just about every community with a court and has collected a lot of information, which much of what she collected from when the database went online in 2013 and now is not in the database. That's the other thing, the database hasn't been updated. And work on virtual cemeteries continues. Eric accordingly contacted us very early on. He was doing work in cemeteries in Portland and had actually noticed some graves and got very interested and called to see what we could do. And so we started working together. And he went to the cemetery once a week, and also to the Oregon Archives in Salem to search out death records. And he now has 1,100 records. It's part of Find a Grave. The patient database will be updated and online, hopefully by the end of this year. We again, we're unaffiliated. We had no money. So, we eventually raised $5,000 between Karen, Nisha and myself, and the, part of which, 2,000 of which we got from my, company that I retired from. So we've got enough to do it. It'll be back online, and we're really happy about that. The other thing is that I mean, the research team now at Fairbanks is me, Nisha, Karen, and Robin. And we're all kind of at that point where we want to find new blood and eventually hand off the project completely. In this, I don't know how many have seen this. If you're from Fairbanks, you have. And this is why we're so committed to the Lost Alaskans. Over the last 2 weeks, the Fairbanks Daily Newsminer documented the return of Lucy McCormick from Morningside. She died there in the 30s. She'd only been there, I believe, 9 months and died. And her family was able to bring her home. And this is an important thing because they're really the first ones to have done that. And they're the first ones that stuck with the process. It's expensive, it's time consuming. And, you know, if we start working on anything else, it'll probably be that, because this was such a big event for Wally and his family. It was a traditional funeral, and it was spearheaded by her son, Wally Carlo. And there was a viewing of tea at the Fairbanks Tanana Chiefs Tribal Hall, and then she returned by river to Rampart for burial. Wally said that it was a glorious homecoming for Grandma Lucy. And that could be repeated hundreds of times. That's how many people want to bring their relatives home, but just don't know how to. The insight, here we go. So I'm going to wait until after sure. So if you have any questions, let's do it then. Is that all right?
Could I interrupt just a second, Ellen? Some people here may not remember what Morningside was set up to do.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah. Morningside Hospital was a contractor with the Department of the Interior to provide care to people who were insane. I mean, that's the way it was described by them. Many years later, we helped the courts define what that meant, and the Mental Health Trust Authority, of course, grew out of Morningside. And so Mental Health Trust provides funding and services to people in the 4 beneficiary groups: people who are mentally ill, people with developmental disabilities, chronic alcoholics, and people with dementia. And it opened in 1904, closed early 50s, mid 50s or so, stayed open, and then burned down in the 60s. We spent a lot of time looking for the patient records. That was like, you know, the gold at the end of the rainbow. We never found them. There was a lot of discussion about what had happened to them, but we never located them. So we're very fortunate to have the records from the archives.
Where was Morningside Hospital?
Portland. Yeah. I don't know if it's actually it's the same property where the 201 mall is.
What was it specifically for Native?
No. Actually, most of the first people who went there were miners or their wives or people who would come up and just, you know, Alaska didn't work for them in 1904. So, and then later on, it became the percentage of Native Alaskans increased, and I think that really started in the 20s when they began accepting children.
Maybe, Ellen, one other quick thing. Would you explain how someone would end up at Morningside?
Okay. This is why the judges, it was so important to get the judges involved in the private market. As a territory, the process was that the marshals would go out to the village after someone had complained about a person, bring the person into Fairbanks and put them in jail. And there would be essentially a full-blown trial with 6 jurors who would determine whether or not the person was insane. And going into this, we thought there was probably a huge lack of due process. But as it turns out, there were a lot of controls on it. And sometimes they bring somebody in and it was clear that they're intoxicated. So they just put them in a cell, watch them for a couple days, then take them to court, and then often they were determined to be safe. So, it's been surprising from the beginning.
Other questions?
I know about it, 2 cases. One of them was a 10-year-old boy in Dillingham who shot and killed his younger sister. This was in 1925 or something like that. And I found this out in reading the Anchorage Daily Times, and then they sent him to Morningside. Yeah. That's all I know, but I know some of the descendants of that family, and they didn't know anything about that.
Yeah. Well, once we get the database back up, hopefully they'll be able to find it.
Yeah. And then the other thing, there was a saying, like, kind of sarcastic or humorous, like, outside.
Inside, outside,
and Morningside.
Yeah.
People that couldn't hack it.
Right.
My daddy in Alaska, and then they shipped them to Morningside.
Yeah. Well, Karen was telling me too that parents used to threaten their children being sent to Morningside.
There aren't any responses to this recent situation with the body being brought back to the Carlo situation, because I think that's the kind of thing that brings attention to an issue, and because it's told in a very human way, people understand that now.
Yeah.
And I think it's against this background that Eleanor Joan Haddon on Anchorage has been trying to get her auntie repatriated from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where she was sent off, died, and they put them into a mass grave.
Yeah.
And they've been trying now genetically to identify who she was so that they can bring the bodies back. So I think it's against this background that this is happening, and there's more momentum trying to get those things done.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a question in the back.
Yep.
Way back. Way back, and then we'll come to the near back.
Another child has been born and died either in childbirth or soon after, and she was this morning.
Oh, yeah.
That is what they detailed in between.
Yeah.
This is not a minor who was drunk in March came out and
oh yeah.
How many cases with not much resolved? What would the proportion be in range of stuff?
Ellen, can you repeat the question? The
Yeah,
sunlight, you couldn't hear it.
I'm sorry, what was the proportion of what?
Oh, like one side and sister. Maybe
Right, yeah, yeah.
In all cases subjected, a marshal, they're all human beings.
That's right.
Doesn't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That very chances that.
Yeah.
Part of the situation.
Yeah, I agree. It's, the problem is we don't, another issue with database is we would like to be able to make it more researchable. Right now it's searchable on Maine, and that's it. One day it would be nice to be able to do searches on, how many women this age were admitted for depression. Theoretically that's possible because the information's in there. So Yeah.
We have time for one more question, yes.
Yes, I presented on Friday about a Haida woman named Agnes McAlpin. Actually, one of her sons was committed to Morningside and during World War II. So I found out about it on his draft card. Oh. And also through newspaper reports. So you get from newspapers.com and Chronicling America. But I'm assuming they said he was cured in the newspaper article, and that's why he was released after 10 months in 1942. I mean, if it was seriously a mental institution, that seems like a very fast cure for some sort of psychosis, but then he came out with the stigma of having been in a mental hospital. And I read somewhere that Alaska had this contract because there was no place in Alaska to put people who were habitually drunk. You know, he got arrested for piloting his gas boat while he was drunk. So, and that there was no place to imprison people, or there weren't mental hospitals in Alaska. Do you have any comments about, is that true?
That's true. There were not. Yeah, that's why Congress allowed, you know, the Morningside contract. Alaska Psychiatric Institute was the first, and that was in the 50s.
You have 2 comments from online. Where can you make donations? And one person who wants to be a part of your research group.
Well, great. Yeah, I'll respond to them later.
Yeah.
If I could. Yeah. Okay, so
yeah.
Good. So sure, we'll talk to you about the work that he did, and then we'll take some questions and hopefully lots of ideas.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm just getting the presentation set up. All right. Hi. So I'm here today to talk about my master's paper research, which focused on the Lost Alaskans Morningside Hospital History Project as a case study in the field of archival studies. And I'll be referring to this project as the MHHP throughout this presentation. So as Ellen talked about, I first started researching Morningside as an undergraduate student in Portland, Oregon, where I wrote my senior thesis on the history of Morningside Hospital. So it was both sort of a local history project and not, because of course this hospital was in Portland, but the story is so wrapped up in Alaskan history. And I used the MHHP's online resources really extensively for that thesis. And so it felt like a natural place to return to for my master's paper in library science. And for that paper, I interviewed MHHP volunteers as well as researchers who had used their resources. And I wanted to understand what volunteers and researchers found important about their work, and also how the project fits into other models of archival projects. So my master's paper looks at the MHHP through the lens of community archives and virtual reunification, exploring the history and the future of this project. So in this presentation, I'll start off with a quick explanation of community archives and of virtual reunification. And then I'll discuss 2 pairs of themes that emerged from my interviews: privacy and access, and sustainability and independence. So my goal with this presentation is to bring the language and the concepts of archival studies into this discussion about the future of the MHHP. And I hope that having this ground vocabulary will be helpful in imagining what's next for the project. So the term community archives is actually deceptively simple, and at its most basic, a community archive is an archive about, by, and for a particular community. Oftentimes, these communities are marginalized groups that may be missing or misrepresented in mainstream archives, which are usually connected to governments or to universities. And some notable examples of community archives are SADA, which is the South Asian American Digital Archive, and the Lesbian Herstory Archives. And while SADA is primarily digital and the Lesbian Herstory Archive has a physical space in New York City, both are independent archives with donor-funded models that collect material relating to the history of a marginalized community in American society. And much of this documentation comes from the types of material that don't often make their way into mainstream archives. Things like personal diaries, oral histories, and ephemera like ticket stubs and flyers. Community archives are not new, but archivists have paid a lot more attention to them in the past 2 decades. In particular, scholars like Michelle Caswell and Marika Seafor are interested in how the work of community archives can change the public memory of a particular historical event, era, or community. The MHHP shares a lot of similarities and some key differences with this basic conception of community archives. Like other community archives, the MHHP is grassroots and not built into an existing mainstream archive. It focuses on a particular community, Alaskan Morningside patients, and it aims to use historical records to bring this marginalized community's story back into public memory. Unlike other community archives, the MHHP does not collect new material. Instead, it digitizes material already held in disparate mainstream archives. And also, unlike other community archives, the MHHP is not created directly by the community it documents, although the volunteers share important identities with Morningside patients, like being Alaskan or in some cases being relatives of Morningside patients. And archivists are coming to understand that community archives come in many different forms and don't all follow one particular model. But it's still useful to trace what makes a particular community archive stand out from the pack. And in the case of the MHHP, what makes it the most distinct is its use of a strategy that I've called guerrilla virtual reunification. So virtual reunification is the strategy of reassembling physically dispersed heritage collections to produce a consolidated digitized representation of scattered archival records of a single origin. In plain English, that means taking records that were physically separated, digitizing them, and putting them together into one online collection. It's a strategy that was developed for situations where valuable historical collections could not be physically reunited due to conflicting ownership claims, despite the scholarly benefit of being able to view them as one whole. So Ricardo Punzalan, who has done the majority of scholarly work on this issue, stresses that virtual reunification is the result of partnerships between institutions that own pieces of a physically dispersed collection. The MHHP is involved in a sort of virtual reunification, but it's different than what Punzalan describes. Instead of all these archives with Morningside-related records coming together to digitize those records, MHHP volunteers have gone to these archives and digitized the records themselves. And so I've called this strategy guerrilla virtual reunification because it relies on independent volunteers to initiate and carry out the work of reunification rather than formal partnerships between owning institutions. So the diagram on this slide shows how MHHP volunteers scan material from many different mainstream archives and then combine them into one single online repository, morningsidehospital.com. And from 2013 to 2020, and then hopefully again later this year, morningsidehospital.com was home to a searchable patient database built from these digitized records. So the MHHP has proven that it's possible for virtual reunification to occur outside of the realm of owning institutions, but Punzalan's insistence on the importance of partnerships between institutions isn't without reason. Punzalan argues that these partnerships provide a space for institutions to hash out issues of access and ownership over their respective pieces of the collection, as well as ensuring a funding base for the project. The ad hoc nature of the MHHP's virtual reunification strategy leaves these questions unanswered. And so the second half of this presentation will focus on exactly these questions of access, privacy, and sustainability. So the first pair of themes coming out of my interviews with Morningside volunteers and researchers is privacy and access. And I've paired these themes together not to imply that the two ideas are opposed or that you can't have both, but to show that they are often in tension with one another. Privacy and access are both archival principles. Archivists collect material because we want to share it with the world. We also know that some information is particularly sensitive. We have ethical and sometimes legal responsibilities to deal with sensitive information in particular ways. And health information is one of the prime examples of information that archivists are wary about making public. And the quarterly reports digitized by the MHHP include identifiable information about people who struggled with stigmatized conditions like schizophrenia and alcoholism. As far as I can tell, HIPAA would not apply to these quarterly reports, but I know many archivists who would place restrictions on viewing these types of records anyways. And on the other hand, access is a fundamental value for the field of archives, and especially for community archives. For one, part of the ethos of community archives is increasing access by bringing collections closer to home for the communities that they represent. Travel within Alaska is enough of a barrier, and most of the records that this project has digitized come from archives outside of the state. And so putting the records online is actually a huge step in making them useful for the people who need them. And additionally, community archives often have a goal of increasing public awareness and understanding of a particular community. And so these records that they collect are the primary way that they foster that understanding. So how can we square these sometimes competing values of access and privacy in the context of Morningside records? One strategy for protecting individual privacy is to redact names when making hospital records available. Of course, this makes the records useless for genealogical research, which is one of the primary purposes of the MHHP. I learned from my interviews with MHHP volunteers that while they've thought carefully about issues of privacy, they fundamentally believe that these records should be as publicly available as possible. Instead of redacting records or limiting access behind a waiver, the volunteers I spoke to talked about presenting the information in sensitive and respectful ways, especially when dealing with people who might have familial connections to Morningside. And so that means bringing the appropriate gravitas to a conversation when pointing people to the Morningside website and encouraging folks to look at those materials in a comfortable and private environment. And in that regard, putting these records online is hugely important because it allows folks to review them in the privacy of their own homes instead of having to absorb these traumatic histories while surrounded by strangers in an archive reading room. And so this level of rapport is a particular strength of community archives, which enable volunteers and researchers to approach each other with a shared level of understanding and community context. So the other pair of themes that came out of my research is the tension between sustainability and independence. Like many community archives, the MHHP values its independence. Operating outside of mainstream archives has allowed volunteers to work at their own pace and towards their own goals. It also keeps the work closer to the community of people that it aims to serve. So independence brings a lot of value to community archival projects, but it also makes community archives more precarious than their mainstream counterparts. And so sustainability becomes a major challenge. Like many community archives, the MHHP has struggled with finding a sustainable model of operation. Work on a particular aspect of the mission is dependent on having a volunteer with enough motivation and free time and expertise to devote to that aspect, which of course may change over the years. And some projects, like the patient database, require ongoing maintenance. So the database was built and went online in 2013, but became unusable and was taken offline in 2020. And it's taken 3 years for the database to hopefully come back online at the end of the year. So this is a really common stumbling block across all types of community archives that attempt digital collections. These initially successful projects eventually fail a few years down the line when technological challenges arise that the archive doesn't have the capability to solve. And so it seems somewhat counterintuitive, but documents are actually safer long-term when forgotten in a basement than when digitized. Some community archives have approached the issue of sustainability by redefining their independence. They may choose to partner with a mainstream archive for assistance with collection management, or they might relinquish control over their collections entirely by donating them to a mainstream archive. Other community archives have dug further into their independence by initiating grant or donor funding models, as is the case with SADA and the Lesbian Herstory Archive. Generally, this approach requires a huge investment of time, labor, and coordination. For example, SADA has 6 full-time staff members. And the folks who created the MHHP aren't looking to make this their full-time job, and that's a completely understandable position. So it's not my place to say which approach is right for the MHHP. After all, this project has already shown great capability for innovation through their unique virtual reunification strategy. But I think the most important next step is having clarity of vision for the project's long-term goals, and then working backwards from there to figure out how to achieve them. So my master's paper was an attempt to bridge the world of professional archives and the MHHP with the hope that both groups could learn something from one another. And the main thrust of my master's paper was that examining the MHHP could teach archivists about the possibilities of guerrilla virtual reunification and the challenges of balancing privacy and bringing marginalized stories to the forefront. But as much as the MHHP can teach archivists, I hope that this introduction to the world of community archives can help chart a path forward for the MHHP in a way that makes sense to their goals and needs. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ellen, who will talk a little bit about where the project is heading, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
One thing I forgot to tell you too is when we got done with the database, station database, we estimated there were between 4,000 and 4,500 unduplicated patients in there, and 15,000 records. So it's a pretty good size. We've got more information to put in there, but the last slide. Hey. Nope, one after that. There we go. So, these are really the things that will keep this project going. One thing is an organizational home. We've talked with Native organizations. We've had a few conversations with folks at the university, and the one big stumbling block has been that most people we talked to wanted to kind of close the database down so that either only families could do research, or only people from one community or whatever. And we really don't want that to happen. Besides the fact that it's so long ago, these records were never, these records were always open to the public because they were governmental records. If you really wanted to know, you could probably get a copy of an invoice. But we would like to have as few restrictions on the database as possible. The funding would be database support, not just keeping it going, but really there's a lot more to go in there. So, and then of course continued research, because there's still documents out there, and administration of kinds of project, which we just do to text each other at this point. It's it really could be a little more organized. And then people. All of us are now retired. Two of our members have died. We're getting close to the point to be ready to hand it off. And so we'd like to find some people who are intrigued by as intrigued by the story as we were 13 years ago. So if any ideas you have would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah.
There's a fanfic there.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
it's me.
Go ahead.
It's me again.
Yeah.
The person I referenced, who was in Morningside, had also been at Chemawa boarding school.
Yeah.
So I found his records from Chemawa, which of course is still in operation, but the National Archives at Seattle had very valuable student records and correspondence connected with his name. There were pages and pages. It was extremely useful. You know, a letter from his mother seeking to take him home for a vacation, and the refusal, and her aunt's intervention. It was, you know, just very, very rich materials. You know, I know the Carlisle records are open because there's a college that has taken them over, and anybody can get those records through a home computer. But I was just thinking, because there's so much interest now, as somebody else mentioned, in the boarding school experience. It's in pop culture. It's an episode of the Yellowstone spinoff, Reservation Dogs. You know, it's really coming to the public consciousness. Is there any way to find out how many Morningside patients were also in the boarding schools as this one person that I'm researching?
Yeah, I don't know. The only way you find that out is if they had a database too, that we could compare names.
Well, they do. So they do, but you have 15,000 names, I guess. If you have the capability, you could run that through the Carlisle database.
Oh, it's
just
Carlisle.
open.
But just Carlisle has that?
It's not.
It's not all boarding schools. It's just
No, only Carlisle.
Oh,
only Carlisle. Yeah, because I think it's Dickinson College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Did that. They just made it trans. They have sensitivity warnings that you might find very disturbing material in this, but yeah, it's just open to anybody. And National Archives, you have to put in a request, but then I don't think they deny many people. It takes them a week to scan. I think I had to pay for the scan, so it was very reasonable. So, yeah. It's an idea just for funding.
Yeah, no, those are good resources. I get to Pennsylvania on a regular basis, so.
Are there other suggestions?
So my question is about organizational home and funding and kind of the background of that. Why has the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority dropped the funding, and what was the relationship of the project to Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority, and is there a potential for a home with that agency?
We actually talked to them, and they're very much behind the project at the beginning. We got the grant, and but now, I mean, they've changed over time too. They're much more internally focused with the lands and the trust funds, and they're really not interested in getting deeply involved or taking it over.
In your, if I can follow up, in your view, should they be? It seems like it is.
Yes,
it would likely fall within their bubble, right?
Right. Morningside is the reason there is a trust, so it makes perfect sense. But yeah, so I don't want to.
I guess I would advocate for some advocacy then.
Yeah,
in that arena.
Have you done something similar in Oregon to see if anyone there is interested in?
No, we haven't. I think probably mostly because we like to keep it in state. Yeah.
I think is there another question there?
Were there a lot of patients at Morningside from other places besides Alaska?
No.
It was only
totally.
Alaska.
It was totally, the contract was for Alaska.
That's interesting. Got it.
So you have the federal government who is supporting Morningside and supporting this development.
Right.
And there is the potential, it seems to me, that the National Institute of Mental Health would be a possible funding source. But I think the Mental Health Trust, as Ellen has said, is also incredibly key because they were formed at the time that Morningside was done away with, and the state assumed responsibility, and there was a settlement of land in order to make money available for services to people in need. And so there's the types of connections that Ellen is drawing are very direct ones to responsibility. We just need those responsible parties to step up.
I assume you've talked to the congressional delegation, particularly Senator Murkowski?
No, we actually haven't.
She's been quite receptive to our organization on digitization of the archives in Seattle. And she's a big booster of the Native community, so that maybe some opportunity there. She has an earmark process online for securing grants.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, yeah.
What about your comments about Shear's presentation and the need to consider how you manage this? Suppose it was unlimited money. What would be the structure? Because you're dealing not just with entering material, you're dealing with managing that material, and you're dealing with privacy issues and all sorts of those considerations.
I do not have an answer to that, but I do have an avenue, and I really appreciated your presentation, Sheer. I'm working on as an evaluator of a project for Indigenous librarians and archivists. And these are issues that they deal with all the time. This is culturally sensitive, or it could be proprietary information, et cetera. So I guess I would suggest having a dialogue with Indigenous librarians about how they're dealing with this issue. In general, my belief or my understanding is they're more towards the privacy side than the access side. In general, access is available, as you were saying that you didn't really want to have certain classes of people, but they're dealing with the issue. So it seems to me that's a dialogue that might be worth having.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, another reason to believe, of course, the big issues, the diagnoses, and but it's from that you get a very clear picture of mental health in the early 1900s, and it was something that they, was kind of the model they went with all through those years.
We have a question online.
Yeah, Jan Monteith, you can unmute and share your thoughts.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I just want to thank everyone for having this session, and it ties in with the paper I presented, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there in person, both for when I presented my paper, but more just something to think about. In the case that I talked about on Friday, it was about a Tlingit leader, Hitsati, and for the people in Ketchikan, the Tlingit people, it's long been part of the oral history, and part of my paper was talking about trying to find more in terms of court documents, which still seems like it's going to be a bit of a scavenger hunt, because even working with the state archives, the criminal and civil records for that early time period are just missing in action right now. But I think an important thing to talk about or think about is, the whole topic of being sent off to Morningside Asylum or Morningside Hospital. Many of the elders said, we don't want to talk about it because, that was a family member being literally going through the court system, being certified as criminally insane. But I think most of us as scholars of the history understand that there's not even a fine line between being a rebel and an innovator, or being someone and some of the arrests that were made and people who were convicted of being criminally insane, in my research anyway, and I'm going to do more work after hearing this, is literally some of the Tlingit Hitsatis that were standing up for social justice and standing up for their land rights. And whether it was intentional, whether it was accidental, whether some of them had issues that might have been even designated today as being criminally insane. I think some of them were just standing up for their rights. When I looked at the Morningside documents years ago, 30 years ago, you know, some of them it talked about, I remember and wrote down in my research notes that it said criminally insane, pretty cryptic, and then it said speaks in tongues or speaking in tongues. You know, we might think of that today for someone who's a mono kind of lingual person, but for those folks, many of them were multilingual, and speaking in tongues wasn't something, you know, they weren't crazy. They were just who they were. They were leaders and they knew multiple languages. So, you know, sometimes if we can, as scholars, talk about these things on a level of social justice and thinking about them and historical trauma today, I think it's really important, because I'm convinced through oral histories of people and without paper documents to back up the alternative, that these were people standing up for their people's rights, their land rights, their resource rights. And on the darkest level, it was non-natives who were literally trying to institutionalize them and get them out of the picture. Thank you. But thank you for all the work all of you are doing. And I think this is a really important topic for thinking about intergenerational trauma. And Gunesh Chish, Atlain Gunesh Chish. And please, I hope somebody gets me in the loop with this group. Thank you.
I'll just jump in and say, I think the issue of language that you brought up is especially important, because no doctors or nurses or anyone who worked at Morningside spoke any Alaska Native languages. And in some of the research that I did in my undergrad thesis, which I used the quarterly reports for, I found that Alaska Native patients were more likely than white patients to be diagnosed with a form of schizophrenia, that a lot of the symptoms are about having flat affect or disorganized speech, things that, you know, we can make some educated guesses that those were being applied disproportionately because these were patients who did not have English as a first language or spoke English at all, and were being diagnosed by medical professionals who did not speak their language.
Yeah, I would just emphasize that. Yeah, some of them didn't know English very well, you know, even though I just said they were multilingual speakers. And so in this process today, we would have said, wow, a miscarriage of justice even through the court system. I doubt that they had translators. You know, it just seems, yeah, anyway, a failure of our justice system.
Yeah. Well, they are bringing up a point that when they were determined to be insane, and you mentioned that they had juries, how did they pick the jury? Were they a jury of peers, or were they a consistent number of people just for this facility?
No, it was what I've seen is different people every time. It was all men, of course, you know, at the beginning. But the person on trial also had medical evaluation, something I didn't talk about.
We have time for one more question, and Karen is waiting to get in. So Karen, would you go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to make a plug for the Alaska Mental Health Trust History Project Jukebox, that there's oral history interviews. It's mostly about the history of the Mental Health Trust settlement and the authority, but there are certainly references to Morningside in that history. The other thing I wanted to sort of bring up, the idea of, you know, a mainstream archives taking over the sponsorship of the Morningside project. And I'm guessing you guys are facing the institutional challenges of the privacy issues, and that they want funding in order to maintain the digital database. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And if people in the group have ideas of how to get around those institutional roadblocks.
I think you want to answer that.
Well,
I think
I was just gonna say, we're not limiting our search to universities or, you know, usual places. You know, if we found a way to do it, not only, well, we can't do it now. But if we need to leave the process open, we need to leave the records open, and well, or we need to learn to let go, which is you know, so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about it. We've got a lot more time to spend.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen and Sheer. Appreciate this session.
Yeah.